This is Distant Replay.
It's time for another true crime edition of the podcast. Today we're focused on a pretty well-known basketball player that is no longer with us, Lorenzen Wright. You probably know him best from his Memphis days. At least that's what I know him best. I think Mike too. But today we're focused on his death, his murder, and taking you back to that story. This will be part one. We don't know if it's going to be 2 parts or 3 parts, but we're definitely going to be multi-part series on Lorenzen Wright and his murder because it's a very interesting case and one we're going to dive into today on the podcast. Welcome in, Mike. How do we get to Lorenzen Wright today?
Another listener suggestion. He is one of these ones again where pretty much from the first day we've started this true crime series, which is over 30 episodes now, this is a case that people wanted us to look into. And to be honest, until recently, I haven't taken a deep dive into it. And when I did, it's one of those ones I couldn't believe wasn't on my radar sooner. So I'm excited to get into it.
Yeah, I'd kind of forgotten about his death, honestly. It happened in 2010, right? And it's been a little while, but I just kind of totally forgot about it. It's kind of out of my mind. So when you mentioned it and I looked it up, I was like, oh, I'm very interested to hear this story because I don't remember very many of the details at all. So this should be a very interesting story. But we do appreciate the recommendations. Again, you can send them to us via the website, distantreplaypodcast.com. We put all of our games up there. So if you're going to go back and watch the games that we have talked about through the past couple of years, they're all on our website. But also on Twitter, Instagram, and then YouTube as well. A lot of our comments come from YouTube. Appreciate everybody that engages with our videos. But if you haven't hit like on this video, please do, and subscribe to the channel as well. All right, Lorenzen Wright. So let's start with his background, Mike, a little bit. For people that maybe aren't familiar with him because he has been gone for more than a decade now, to kind of give a little background on who he is.
Yeah, so if you follow basketball, if you came up when me and Ben did, Lorenzen Wright is definitely a name you know. And the reason that is he was a very good college player at Memphis. All right, so when I think of Lorenzen Wright, I sort of think of Memphis, and I think of him being kind of in between Penny Hardaway. He was right after Penny Hardaway at Memphis, and obviously before like the Derrick Rose era. I think of Lorenzen Wright sort of bridging that in my mind, at least. I'm sure Memphis fans have more players in between there that they think of, but Lorenzen Wright was a stud, man. He was a second-team All-American at Memphis. This is very much a Memphis story, right? So he played his later in high school in Memphis. He played in college in Memphis. And as we'll get to a little bit later, he also played professional basketball for the Memphis Grizzlies. So we're talking about a guy, Ben, that was very involved in the community, very well liked in the community. So it's a case that like in Memphis, like rocked the whole city kind of thing.
Yeah, I can believe that. I remember him most as just a Memphis guy. I think of him as the Grizzlies more so, and I think he got traded to the Grizzlies the first year they started in Memphis. So it kind of made sense. He was kind of the face of that team, being a Memphis guy. It all kind of tied together. So that's what I remember of him.
Yeah, and he was actually drafted, Ben, 7th overall by the Clippers, so a very high draft pick.
Yeah.
He played 14 seasons in the NBA from 95 to 09, and he earned $55 million in his career. So a very productive career in terms of money made, in terms of lasting 14 years in the league. So definitely a solid NBA career for Lorenzen Wright. And, you know, he retires in 2009, and his true crime story begins here in 2010.
So 2010. So that after a very good career, as you mentioned, a very well-liked guy, and a guy that's very involved and gives back a lot of his time and money, even started a memorial fund for his daughter, his infant daughter he lost in 2003. So a guy that's well thought of, and then this takes us to this horrible day in 2010.
Yep. So the day in question is July 18th, 2010. All right. Lorenzen Wright is back in Memphis to attend a baby shower for his sister who was living in Memphis. So at this time, Ben, post-retirement, Lorenzen Wright's living in Atlanta. And it's one of those things. So he comes up to attend his sister's baby shower. He's hanging out with some people in the neighborhood, sort of reconnecting when you come home kind of thing. Yeah. Something I think we've all done. None of us have probably ever been as famous as Lorenzen Wright, but
right.
But he's making the rounds, hanging out with people, etc. His last known whereabouts were at his ex-wife Shara's house a little before midnight in a town called Collierville, Tennessee. All right. What's important to remember is after that, no one thought they had any communication with Lorenzen. So the last person to see him alive and account for him was his ex-wife, Shara. His mother, after no one can kind of track him down or find him, his mother called the police department that they couldn't find Lorenzen. Now, the thing is people thought that she may have jumped the gun calling the police, but everyone in Memphis knows Lorenzen Wright. So what happens here is like the cops send out feelers to people they know in the neighborhoods like, hey, have you seen him? Because his family's looking for him. His family and police call everyone they know trying to track him down. They have no luck. So they actually end up filing a missing persons report. But at this point, Ben, his family's not like 100% convinced that he's actually missing, right? It's one of those things where I think the mother had kind of a gut instinct something was wrong, but, you know, he had taken off and went on like unannounced trips to Europe before. So there wasn't a super amount of concern. But as the days went on, people got more concerned.
Okay.
It sort of similarities been in this respect to the James Jordan story that we also did a multi-part podcast on.
Yeah.
Where due to the times, and this is a little bit later now, we're talking 2010, but you know, people were still not in constant contact with through technology in 2010 the way they even are just 11 years later.
Right.
So this is not like abnormal behavior for him to maybe disappear for a couple of days. As the days grow on, though, the mother is pleading on TV for him to call if he's okay. At this time, because they have nothing to go on, the police aren't considering foul play.
Okay.
Right. This goes on for 9 days, from July 18th, and then on July 28th, his body is found in a wooded area in Memphis. So we're talking about it's very important to remember, we're talking like a very secluded area that you wouldn't probably go unless you were meeting someone there. That kind of area. Like You're not going to say, hey, let's meet here, and do whatever. Like it's way off the beaten path.
Okay.
Now remember, we're in Memphis in the summer here. So because of the heat and because of the rain, even it was only, like I said, 8-9 days, his body had decomposed to the point where he only weighed 57 pounds.
Wow.
Yeah. So, and again, this is a major storyline here because they don't have, they could tell that he was shot at least 5 times, but some of the evidence they would be able to get from the crime scene may have washed away with the rain, from the heat, may have decomposed his body to a point where there's evidence they could go off of, but now they can't. So it is kind of a big deal.
That's crazy. I just expect it to take a lot longer for a body to decompose that much. That seems like a pretty significant. You're talking about an NBA big man to be decomposed to just 57 pounds in 10 days. That seems like it's on the extreme end. But
It does. And you know what I learned is that like how much the heat can impact things.
Yeah.
Heat combined with rain, from what I looked into, were the biggest factors. I had never known that either, so I'm with you on that. Now, one thing we learned in the coming days is there was a call that came into the Germantown police. So we have Collierville, Germantown, and Memphis. Those are 3 cities to just keep in mind.
And just for reference, they're all kind of like suburbs of Memphis, essentially.
Exactly. It's exactly what I was getting at. So we're in a situation now with different jurisdictions. Again, Similar to the James Jordan case. Remember that?
Yep.
So a call came in, they sort of start doing some investigation, and they find, the Memphis police find that a call came into the Germantown police a little bit after midnight on the 19th, okay? It was a kind of call where it was a call, so someone placed a call to 911, no one spoke, but then all you heard was a series of gunshots. So at the time, the 911 operator, you could hear her saying, all I could hear is gunshots, no one's talking, right?
Yeah.
So what they do is they try to triangulate that call to see where it came from. And I guess the technology they were using was like largely cell phone based and 2010 cell phone based. So it wasn't like an exact triangulation. They used some kind of, basically, I guess for that time, primitive way to track a cell phone. Mm-hmm. So they try to triangulate where the call came from to follow up on it. And the triangulation brings them into a jurisdiction right outside Germantown.
Okay.
So when that happens, they just say, not our jurisdiction.
Wow.
And they didn't notify the Memphis police about it until 7 or 8 days later.
Jeez.
So they notify the Memphis police about this call 7-8 days later. The Memphis police then gets more specific cell data, pinpoints the exact location where the call came from, And that's how they end up finding Lorenzen Wright's body.
So they made it. They could have found him much earlier had they been alerted, potentially.
Yeah. So basically, what it makes it sound like is the Memphis police had access to like more updated cell phone tracking technology, and they were able to pinpoint exactly where the call came from, which led them right to Wright's body.
Jeez.
What in the moment, the Germantown police were like, not our jurisdiction. Oh well.
Yeah.
And never notified Memphis till 7-8 days later. So that sort of filled in the gaps for me of how they found his body, because that wasn't clear to me at first, but that's how they found it.
Okay.
Now, because of how poorly it was handled, it, like I said before, it left the investigators with very little to go on. The crime scene was not much help. I mean, we see all the time, Ben, in these, the show 48 Hours, right? Mm-hmm. It's named that for a reason. A lot of what happens the first 48 hours after a murder can really help you solve the case.
Right.
Now, because of that, the trail goes cold. There's no viable leads coming in as to what happened to him, and no one in the community is talking. So if people know what happened to him, they are not speaking to law enforcement about it. Okay? So that takes us through the fact that Lorenzen Wright was shot, where he was found, some mitigating factors on why he wasn't found right away.
Yeah.
Some other things, Ben, I think worth getting into in this episode is, because some people thought it contributed to his death, was that Lorenzen made $55 million in his career, like I mentioned before. But at the time of his death, he was in financial trouble. We're talking homes in foreclosure, checks bouncing, things of that nature. So we're talking financial strife here, to say the least.
Yeah.
Now, he asked one of his buddies, like, that he knows from Memphis, like, how do I begin to get myself out of this situation? Like, how do I begin to dig out? And the buddy says, hey, look, you have some cars that I don't think you have any need for. You might want to start by selling off these cars, right? So the buddy recommends, hey, look, I know a guy named Bobby Cole who's a car enthusiast, but also happens to be a high-ranking member of a notorious drug gang in Memphis called the Pettis Organization. This guy's name is Bobby Cole. So Wright's buddy says, hey, why don't you sell some of your cars to him as a way to sort of get some money, right? Well, what they do, and I guess this is very common, is he sells the cars to this Bobby Cole. But because Bobby Cole's a drug dealer, he can't just buy a car from Lorenzen Wright for this amount of money, multiple cars, and put the cars in his name. You know what I mean?
Gonna raise a few flags, yeah.
Yeah. And drug dealers, amongst the businesses they're in, is like trying to keep a low profile as far as buying big things goes. Mm-hmm. So they keep the cars in Wright's name because, the guy is not going to be able to get a loan. He probably doesn't want to get a loan or get on anyone's radar. So they keep the cars in Wright's name. While investigating the drug organization, the feds come across the cars that Bobby Cole has, at his house or when they're surveilling him. Mm-hmm. So they do some investigating into those cars. Like, how was he able to buy these? If he's living the lifestyle on paper he says he's living, when we think he's a drug dealer. So through that investigation, they come to the conclusion that these certain cars are in Wright's name. So the feds go and question Lorenzen Wright. And he doesn't deny. He says, look, I sold the cars to Cole, but he was not aware of them being involved in any criminal activity or anything of that nature. From then, one of the theories at the time was Cole had a vendetta against Lorenzen Wright for how that all went down. The fact that he even spoke to the feds in the manner that he did.
His name, yeah.
Yeah. Wright's mother is telling the investigators, Lorenzen Wright's mother is telling the investigators from day one, I have a feeling this may be linked to those cars, Mm-hmm. So that's one of the theories right away, is that it's a vendetta by this Bobby Cole that led to Wright's death.
Okay.
Another theory that comes from Shara Wright, who we mentioned before, the ex-wife of Lorenzen.
Who he was visiting, right?
He was visiting. She's the last person to see him alive.
Okay.
She sort of presents the theory that she thinks it may have been sort of a drug deal gone bad situation, that Lorenzen was involved in selling drugs. And how she sort of portrays this to police is she says that two men came to her house with guns in waistbands looking for Lorenzen in the weeks leading up to his death, and someone threatened her son at school. So this wasn't corroborated by anyone else. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So this is Shara saying she thinks it might have something to do with these men who have been coming around looking for Lorenzen and threatening her and her family. To add to that, Shara adds on to her story about Lorenzen being at her house that night
Yeah.
and says that Lorenzen came to her house that night with $100,000 and drugs, and a bag of drugs, she put it, and a track phone. Track phone still around, Ben?
I think they might be, but I could never tell you with certainty. I have no clue.
And I think the reason why track phones were probably mentioned this is, I don't know if, do you ever watch The Wire, Ben?
Yeah, that's the first thing I thought of.
That's a major way that they sort of avoided detection from law enforcement, was using track phones. So those phones you have the minutes on, you throw them away. I guess they're harder to track than a conventional cell phone.
Right.
So she's just basically painting a picture of him being involved in some kind of drug deal. Now, that would explain to law enforcement, they're like, well, maybe this makes sense. Maybe that's why he went to this remote area. Remember I told you he went to a remote area where no one would think to go? Was he on his way to a drug deal because it was a remote location? Did he owe people money? They came for it. And since he didn't have it, they killed him. Like, there was a theory at one point, Ben, that, people from maybe affiliated with a cartel came to the States to collect what Wright owed them. Wright didn't have it. They murdered him and hopped back on a plane and went wherever they came from. Those are like sort of the theories that were floating around. The problem with those theories, and I sort of began to think about this while I was researching, is then why would he call the police?
Yeah.
If he was there because he wanted to be there and things were happening that he was expecting to happen, like he went there knowing he was going to meet people, I would think if he got shot that way, it would have been a situation where he was surprised by it. When he's calling 911, makes me think like he was in a situation where, oh man, this is not what I expected to go down with the people I'm with. I'm calling 911.
Are we certain he called 911?
Yes, we are.
Okay.
Yeah. So up to this point, though, there was no connection known publicly between Lorenzen and this kind of drug dealing ever. This is something that was not. Now it fits though if you're trying to fit the narrative, right? Guy doesn't have money, searching for a way to make money. Is this an easy way to make it?
Yeah.
Then you have the theory with him crossing the drug dealer he sold the cars to.
Yeah. The pieces are there.
Yeah. So up to this point, those are kind of the working theories. But as we'll get into in the next episode, there are some things that police start to question the story of Shara Wright. And that will lead us into our next episode, sort of her talking about her more and her potential role in Lorenzen Wright's death. So that's where we'll take it next week. But I just want to sort of set the scene here with what happened and some of the theories that law enforcement had. But remember, this case is as at this point, and I think the reason why, Ben, you said before maybe you hadn't heard a lot about it was because it was cold for a lot of years.
Right.
So, I sort of just went over the cliff notes of some of the theories they had sort of at the beginning of this. Mm-hmm. But the things would evolve over the years, as I'll get to next week.
Well, make sure you hit subscribe on the podcast or YouTube, whatever it is, wherever it is you listen to the show, because you'll want to follow along the story as it goes along. Already very interesting and unique kind of situation with this one and how it kind of all sets up. And I got a lot of questions already, so I'm very curious to see how this develops from here with the wife's involvement. And we'll do that in the next episode of our true crime series on Distant Replay. We'll have plenty more too. We've got documentary recaps. We also go back and watch old games as well, relive those. So plenty of reasons to be a part of the channel. We love to have you here, and we're glad that you are. So please hit subscribe, share the word, let somebody know about the podcast as well if you haven't. And we'll be back with part 2 of the Lorenzen Wright murder. How much was his wife involved? The details surrounding that. We'll tell you that on the next episode. Mike, thank you.
Hey, pleasure as always, Ben. Until next week.